Hello and welcome back to the chapter 2 of this tutorial. And in this tutorial we'll be going through the methods of creating the forest, and will be our first use of proper PCG nodes structure. And in this case what we're going to do is to create a very convincing forest for this environment. And of course for this one the PCG graph is already prepared with the GitHub repository, but for this matter I like to go through it together and show you step by step on how to achieve that. So to begin with, let's just remove this. And also for this exercise we're gonna use one of the assets, and I already mentioned this on the book, but just to show you clearly what we're going to be dealing with, if you go to your marketplace, and specifically the trees we're gonna actually use for this is actually the trees that comes from Megascan, but also some of the foliage models that comes with it, which actually you can find it in one of the also packages for free. So to show you what I mean by this, I'm gonna type it into my vault, and the assets we're gonna first use the Landscape Pro 2.0, which comes for free. So you can always add it. It's also compatible with the latest version of Unreal. And another one I'm actually going to use for this exercise, it's going to be Megascan. The Megascan I'm going to use for this, it's going to be the European Beach Early Access. There is a little problem here, because at the moment currently it's only supporting 5.3 since we're using 5.4. But don't you worry about this, because the Megascan will be also, by the time the book of the release, also the Megascan should be available for 5.4. But for now, while we're waiting, we can always find solution for this, how to set this up to work with 5.4. To show you very quickly how to do this, let me go through it. So what you need to do is to open one of the Unreal Engine's 5.3 projects or create a new one. So in this case, I'm going to create a blank one. So for this one, make sure you create a new 5.3 project. And for this one, what we're going to do is just create a purely empty project. And what we're going to do this time, we're actually going to import these trees into this project, and then we're going to migrate them. Of course, you don't have to use these mega trees, you can use any other ones, but for this exercise, when you have these Megascan trees available, just download them. So once you ready download, so add them to the project that you wish to add it to, and in this case, we're actually going to use trees projects, the one I've just created. It might take some time until you get all the trees downloaded into your project. And what you're gonna have is the tree available under your content folder. So with this one set up for you, what you need to actually do is then migrate it to the project that we're currently working on. So in this case, I'm gonna right click and literally look for migrate. Click on this. With all this selected, go ahead and proceed, so press OK. So this is the destination that we're working on. So I'm going to select content, and make sure you always select content while you try and migrate the project. Otherwise, it's not going to migrate anything. So press content folder, select folder, and just migrate all the project files for this exercise. So now we can go back to our project that we've been working on. Now you should have all the folders available to work with. So in this case, what we're going to actually do now is to make sure that we are creating the PCG graph specifically for this exercise. So make sure you're on the PCG folder and right click, and also before we do anything, always keep an eye the plugins folders. Your plugin for PCG is enabled. Always make sure you tick the box for the PCG here, the one we're currently working, which is the Procedural Content Generation framework. So with all this set up, let's go to a PCG folder and right click and create a new PCG graph. Let's call it PCG forest and then enter. And now let's start digging into creating our PCG graph. So first things first, let's identify exactly the input values here. So in this case, what we need to do is to set to enable to work with the landscape surfaces. So in this case, what we're gonna do is to replace what we have already here, which is our allowed type into surface. And we can actually call it however you want to. It's called landscape. And then we can then move on to creating our PCG. So in this case, what I'm going to do is right click and look for surface sampler as duplicated twice. So just move them here so they fit into this one column. Another thing what you can actually do, just to make sure that you know which ones you're dealing with, is if you press F2, you can actually rename them however you want to. So I call it SS trees. But you don't have to if you don't want to. You can always keep it as a surface sampler. But because I'm also want to make sure I know what I'm dealing with at the moment, so I'm going to move them around and we're going to set to comment each of these surfaces. So I'm going to select this, press C to comment. I call this trees. Let me change the color so I can set it to like black. There you go. So now let me extend those, just make them a bit bigger. Let's move this out of the way. So now let's do the same thing. So let's right click and create transfer points because we're going to use transfer points for each. And do the same thing, duplicate for one of them as well. And now what we're going to do is to make sure that our inputs connected to our surfaces, just like that. And just to see what's happening, let's debug them. So let me click and select all them to debug, press D to debug. And now, so if I put them right here, then you start seeing, of course, the cubes start to appear. Of course, there's not much going on because there are only surfaces nodes here added as well as enabled, because there's no more any further instructions. Because for this one, what we're actually going to do is to then start adding those to further create much more interesting results. So in this case, what I'm going to do is to disable this debug mode. And I'm going to start off with surface sample, which is the first one on top. And what I'm going to do is connect this to transfer points. And I'm going to then start adding static meshes. So in this case, right click, static mesh spawner, just so that in case what we're dealing with is duplicated twice more so we can have it for each. And then we are ready to work with. And as look at how quickly we are getting somewhere in terms of like getting the structure of our graph. But that's not over it because we still have to add some information here. So in this case, let's start with trees. So in this case, I'm going to do is connect this together with this one. But also what I want to make sure is that I also going to set some transfer points here. So in this case, it's going to diversify not only the direction the trees are pointed, but also have various scales for each point that are going to generate together with static meshes. So I'm going to do is very quickly add some information here. So let's just debug it for now, see what happens on our screen. So while I'm debugging it, I'm going to basically put this on the right hand side and I'm going to start putting values in. So I'm going to basically put some random values here. So I'm going to put -10 here as well. And I'm going to do the same thing for the bottom. And of course, they're not big values, but at least something to work with. And I'm going to set the scale to be kind of randomly. So in this case, it's 1. So I'm going to set it to maximum 2. And I'm going to do across all of them. So as you may see, the randomization for each scale start to take place, which is good. And I'm going to do the same thing for our rotation. So in this case, I'm going to start off with -80. And I'm going to end with a 180. So another thing I'm going to start doing, because we just did this section, I'm going to disable our debug mode and I'm going to start adding the trees. So before we do anything, I want to make sure, I want to know which trees I'm actually wanting to add to it. So in this case, I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm going to have 3 different selections of trees. So for this one, what we're actually going to do is to, under mesh entries, once you have static mesh selected, on the right hand side, I'm going to add 3 entries. To start off, let's go and pick some of the trees here. So in this case, just so that I have some of the selection ready for myself to play with, I'm going to look for European beach forest forest underscore 05. And let's add more. So the trees that I'm going to use for another section, it's going to be a forest. If you just type forest underscore 08, it should give you options here. So there you go. I'm just going to add that one. Now let's do the same thing for the last one. But in the last one, I guess I'm going to use some bit bigger tree than that. So I'm going to look for forest 02. I'm going to use that one. And then let's give it a go and try to see what it looks like. So now you start seeing the trees start to take shape. As you may notice, they're a bit too close to each other. So let's try and see if we can reduce the spacing in between. To do that, we need to go to Surface Sampler here. And we start modifying the changes on our settings panel here. So to do this, what I tend to do is to set the point extent to higher values, because the bigger values, the more space you will give. So let's go 400 on X and Y, on the X and Y axis. And now let's say we're ready with that. So it seems like we are okay. So let me also increase the size of our PCG volume itself. So let me just increase the sizing. All right, cool. Let's get on and continue with other ones. In this case, we are going to add the grass. So let's connect all of them together. And basically, let's do the same for grass. So I want to make sure my surface sampler is set to something like 20, because I want to make sure that grass start to be much closer to each other when they spawn. One of the grass that comes from the other package, and that's nothing Megascan related. So in this case, I'm gonna add this to our entry here. So in this case, it's very simple because it's called just grass. And the grass I'm actually going to use for this is a bush 04. And you can use any other grass that comes with the package. So if you look it up into this folder where we having all the assets, you can see all these assets are available here with other packages. As you may see, we start getting some grass, and that's fine because we can still modify their positions and so on. But let me just add a bit more so that at least we have a bit more options here with the grass itself. But in this case, I'm actually going to use one of the European Beach Megascan assets. In this case, I'm going to look for seedling. That's the name of the assets that comes from Megascan. Then you start seeing there's some seedling takes in place, but you can see how small they are, which is fine because usually those are the small sizes. And to get more out of the spaces that it's pretty much occupying in between, what I'm going to do is also increase on the surface sampler, we're actually going to increase our points per square meter so they get closer to each other. So now you start seeing the grass starting populated properly. And of course, you get a bit darker, which is because of the entire sky as well as lighting. And it's up to how you can sort this out by fixing these and using post-process volume to fix those issues. But because for this exercise, what matters for me the most is that you can get the quality of the PCG working for you. And also because I also need to change some of the transfer points. So while you have this window open for transfer points, as well as, for PCG graph, and you have the viewing on the viewport. So let's just start to clearly play around with the values here. So in this case, I'm gonna use Z-axis. So I'm gonna go -80 to 180. Now you start seeing the rotations of grass start to vary from each other. And let's go the same thing for scale. So let me just set it to like 1.2 and make it a little bit bigger. So every time you seeing the grass popping out, and the grass start to be appearing a little bit more populated, but at the same time the scale sort of feels like it remains the same, right? Because those are the very small values in between, which is kind of by 20% in this case. So let's go and set up the rocks for this. And in this case, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to use one of the rocks that comes from the Megascan. So for the rocks, what I've used is this one here that comes with the Megascan. And I'll show you how to do this because you can actually download this from the Megascan's Quixel. And you can find this right here underneath and the under sign plus sign a Quixel bridge. And the one I'm actually using for, and I made a favorite here, is this one here. So if you look it up, that's the one I'm using. So this is called Nordic Forest. Called Nordic Forest Rock Moss Large. And of course you can pick anything you want, but for this exercise I actually use this one. So let's go back and then I'm going to add one mesh entry, and for this one I'm going to allocate this name of this rock. So compile that, and then you start seeing the rock. And of course it's not correct because we still have to fix some of the issues that we're getting with that. And the reason why it's doing that, because at the moment it's basically takes every space and it usually works on the same number of spacing for each surface sampler. And of course this is what we're gonna do next, is to fix that issue. So let's go back to our graph. And then here, what we're actually going to do is to change and reshuffle some of the numbers here. So first I'm going to set this to 200. Our points extent. And another thing I'm gonna also do, which I think it will be the best thing to do, it's also add this very cool node. It's called a self-pruning node. And what self-pruning does, and let me just add it and then explain it to you in a second. So self-pruning, it helps to allocate your meshes, but at the same time it will remove anything that's overlapping and let the rocks to pass through these objects on the way. So in other words, what's going to happen, it will reshuffle it and make the rocks only take place on the places where there's some empty space. And to do this, of course, we need to connect this. Let me just remove this. And what we can actually do is also set the values. And I think once you see after adding self-pruning, now you start seeing how the rocks are start being placed around it without affecting any other particular meshes, even though you still see the meshes being overtaken with space itself. But we can still fix this by doing another trick. And in this case, but first things first, what I'm gonna do is to go to transfer point and set this to change the rotation. And you can see the rotation of each rock is a bit different. So I'm going to save this. And now I want to also make sure that every time I have an object spawning, the objects are not going to be overlapping with things like trees or grass and so on. So in this case, I'm going to particularly care is trees. So every time you're trying to spawn the trees, sometimes you might be seeing that the rocks are starting to be very close to the trees, but also spawning right next to trees. And that's not something we really want, even though they spawn in the same spot where the trees is. So there's a little fix for that. It's called difference node. So what we need to try to do is to make difference between the trees as well as the rocks, which is the source of the spawning, in this case, position where we want the trees to be spawned. So in this case, what we're actually going to do is to right click, look for difference node. And in between where the self-pruning is, we are going to connect as our source. Let me just disconnect that, call a source. And let me just move this out of the way. And actually making sure that we are using transform point, I'm going to disconnect it and I'm going to put it right next to that. So this is more cleaner and effective and follows the same structure as the other ones too. So I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to move it here. And what I'm going to do is where it shows that there's a trees, we also going to make as a difference, which is the difference that we're taking from the trees that we're about to spawn. But before we do anything, we also need to set up the numbers of trees that are going to set within the range. Because sometimes what happens, if you just do the difference, sometimes we want to also allocate the number of trees once we make any difference. So it subtracts the number of trees at that point where it's supposed to be spawned but be removed. But also we're trying to add a bit the difference by having that solution where we also want to increase the number of trees where around the, let's say, rocks and other assets that are being spawned around the rocks. So to do this, we're just gonna add bounce modifier. And the bounce modifier is very cool. Let me show you what exactly it's doing. So I'm gonna set this to values like minus, let's say 20 for now, and 20. Minus 20. So we do an X, Y, and X, Y position. So I'm going to connect this in between where the static mesh is spawning. And I'm going to put this right here somewhere so we get the trees. But because we are not going to connect together with bounce modifier, this will be a separate thing. I'm going to connect the transfer points directly to the static mesh spawn. So we're going to bypass this section. And we're going to then connect bounce modifier together with a difference node here, which is this one. So we're kind of removing points we don't need, and we just allocated more position for the rocks itself. So I'm going to now connect this directly. So now, as you can see, we're getting a node in between. But this is what it converts the difference nodes into static mesh points through the 2-point, which helps to convert to 2-point format. So now when you start looking into star, you start seeing the difference it started to make, right? As you can see, the trees are starting to popping on its own, and you start seeing some slight difference still of the rocks start to emerging on some sections. And of course, you can still fix this by setting up the different density functions. So if I set to binary, maybe also another trick I can show you is also set the bounce modifier here. So if you set like intersect or include, and the same goes for translate. And of course, you can also do what's happening in the bounce modifier as once they are being generated on the section. So you see the trees are being spawned, and anything that comes around the trees the rocks are kind of being pushed away. And then let's turn this off. Let's try to test this one more. We can set to scale, or we can set to translate. And then you can even go back to the original values you had. And of course, now you start seeing the rocks are kind of being pushed away. They're a bit further away from each other, but that's fine because you can always go to surface sampler on the rocks. You can decrease that. And then we can more visible and also more popping around the trees. And then we can also increase the number maybe here. So 0.5, 1, and make a little bit more here, less. And of course, you get the rocks, which appear where the trees are not there. Then the rocks start to take form and shape. And that's very cool because that's something maybe you want to try on and test it out yourself. But what I would suggest as well is to use self-branding and change your numbers here too. And also go back again to your rocks here and change the numbers there too. Yeah, just play around with them. Find it the most convenient for your solution. This is pretty much what we have done for the forest exercise for the chapter 2. Another thing I have to touch base on is when you're dealing with the landscape itself, what if you want to have something like, I don't know, for example, mountains. And of course, what's happening, if I just demonstrate it to you very quickly, I'm going to sculpt something here, right? And if I turn this off, what's going to happen? You'll be seeing something odd that's taking place with the static meshes. In this case, string being spawned on top of these little mountains here. And why is that so? Well, the truth is that we haven't really set these trees to be spawning on absolute position and offset, which means what is happening here, they're just going to be spawned however the shape of the landscape looks like based on the vertices, which are then being assigned by the points. And they're not having any rotation being sort of resolved by then rotating on its own. So in this case, you need to kind of help by enabling the absolute rotation. And to do this, it's very simple to do. So in this case, what we're going to do is go back to our transform points here, and we're just going to, under transform points, that you should see it's called absolute rotation. If you click on this, now you start seeing the trees start to get fixed. So no matter what you were doing with the landscape, now every time you modify your landscape to whatever shape you want to be, then you can actually go and fix this very easily by just pressing that little option there. And you can make it a little bigger if you want to. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this tutorial was quite useful for you to understand how you can deal with different setup for PCG graph. And because of what you have learned so far, it was another much more advanced extension of the introduction. And by this case, you have more ability to add a bit more structure to your PCG graph and make it more logical to your needs that you want to do, for example, creating forests. But at least what you have done so far is a great example on how you can get introduced more to PCG. Thank you so much, and see you guys in the next chapter.